Well, hello. Thank you very much for your kind invitation. I'm so sorry I can't be with you, but I hope this film will suffice in the meantime, and I've prepared some handouts which I hope will integrate into this film, but also I think will be distributed amongst you. As Richard might have mentioned, a couple of years ago I wrote the book, published the book Monarchy and the End of Empire, about the role of the Crown within both the Commonwealth Realms and the Commonwealth as a whole. And I'd like to address my remarks today largely to the question of the realms and their survival. But I do so with a due sense of humility, certainly in this company. I'm sure you'll all be familiar with Lord Palmerston's remark about the Schleswig-Holstein question. Palmerston said something to the effect that there are really only three people who understand this business. One was the Prince Consort, and he's dead. Another was a German professor who's now gone mad, and the third is me, and I've forgotten everything I ever knew about it. Well, to echo Palmerston, I suspect there are really just a handful of people who really understand the full ins and outs of the Crown and the Commonwealth, and I imagine that probably most of them are gathered with you today. It would be invidious to name names, but Anne and Peter certainly know who you are. There is, of course, one expert who is missing, but even though the organisers seem to have shown tremendous ingenuity in putting together a wonderful programme, I can quite imagine that producing Her Majesty the Queen would have taxed even their ingenuity. As for myself, I mean, having written this book, I think I've acquired at least a superficial smattering of knowledge about the Crown and the Commonwealth, but I certainly wouldn't want to sit an exam on the question, and certainly not one set by Professor Anne Toomey. And this, of course, I think is a problem that Republicans and monarchists alike probably have to admit, that the whole issue of the Crown's role in the Commonwealth, in the realms and as head of the Commonwealth, is quite poorly understood. And it gives us a particular role as researchers and educationalists to raise public understanding and awareness. But it does leave open huge areas of misunderstanding, potential misunderstanding. And when this misunderstanding affects internal public opinion within states and misunderstanding between states, it can become quite an important issue. And certainly I think that worry about misunderstandings, and particularly misunderstandings about Britain's role in all of this, helped to shape the UK's attitude towards Commonwealth realms becoming republics. And I'll say more about that later on. Let me begin the particular theme of my lecture with a little anecdote. A few years ago, 2012, I think, the very eminent Jamaican judge, Patrick Robinson, gave a speech here at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies. He shortly afterwards published a version of that speech in the Round Table under the arresting title "The Monarchy, Republicanism and the Privy Council, an Enduring Cry for Freedom." Robinson's article rehearses the long history of British oppression in the West Indies. Quote, "Born in bloodshed and sustained in bloodshed, the relationship between England and Jamaica was marked by atrocity upon atrocity against the enslaved." And moving on to the meat of his article, the monarchical system. Robinson argues, quote, Jamaica is a post-depression society and its people should not be asked to have as its head of state a person who symbolises the oppression inflicting on their enslaved and other ancestors. So you can see that in the PowerPoint slide. Well, this all went down very well with his audience. It was great blood and thunder stuff and people were very roused. But at the end I asked a sort of slightly mischievous question. I said, well, you know, of course, Ghana became a republic in 1960, over 50 years ago. Tanganyika in 1962, Uganda in 1963, one could go on. So my question to you is, what took you so long? That sort of slightly punctured his balloon, but I think it's a question that deserves to be asked. Put it another way, why has this system of Commonwealth Realms lasted as long as it has? If you simply read the newspapers, you might think that this whole system was on the verge of imminent collapse and that a republic a realm a week was likely to become a republic before very long. In March last year, the press was full of stories of the Prime Minister of Barbados, and I've got a quote from him here, declaring his intention for Barbados to become a republic by 2016. You see the quote from Prime Minister Stewart there. But actually, if you look at the figures, and here's a list on the next slide of Commonwealth realms, and I stress that Commonwealth realms who have become republics rather than British colonies that became republics and independent. You'll see that over the last 50 years, it's not been a very common occurrence. And indeed, if you look at the last 40 years, Trinidad and Tobago became a republic in 1976. Since then, only Fiji and Mauritius have become republics. And of course, Fiji became a republic because of a coup. So only Mauritius, since Trinidad and Tobago, have done this through constitutional means. Mauritius didn't hold a referendum on the matter. And indeed, it looks to me as though you've got to go right back to the Gambia in 1970 to find a case of a realm actually becoming a republic through a referendum. And even those territories that have made the transition to republican status have often done so at a remarkably slow pace. Take Ceylon, another slide here. As early as 1956, Prime Minister Bandaranaike informed Commonwealth Prime Ministers that his country intended to become a republic. In the following year, 1957, he set up a joint select committee to discuss proposals. But it's not until 1972 that Ceylon, as Sri Lanka, actually becomes a republic. So there's a long period of transition. Trinidad and Tobago, we mentioned a minute ago. The movement towards a republic really takes on pace after the Black Power revolt of 1970 and the elections of 1971. But Prime Minister Eric Williams takes it pretty slowly, and partly because, and this is something we'll return to, the Republic is part of a package of reforms, some of which Williams finds easier to take than others. He initially sets up a constitutional commission under Chief Justice Hugh Wooding, but some of Wooding's other proposals, for example, proportional representation, aren't acceptable to Williams. So he rejects many of those and sets up a separate select committee before he gets a set of proposals that he feels able to implement, and Trinidad and Tobago becomes a republic in 1976. Jamaica, of course, which hasn't become a republic yet, but also has a very slow progress to date towards republican status, which you can probably start the clock around 1975 when Prime Minister Michael Manley told the BBC that he broadly favoured a republic. The opposition, Jamaican Labour Party, voiced its support in 1977, and of course 2003 the Prime Minister of Jamaica, P.J. Patterson, calls for his country to abolish the monarchy by 2007, but it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. When the PNP are returned to government at her swearing-in ceremony in January 2012, the new Prime Minister, Portia Simpson-Miller, says, "I love the Queen, she's a beautiful lady, and apart from being a beautiful lady, she's a wise lady and wonderful lady, but I think time come." So she announces that republicanism is back on the agenda, but 4 years later, still no concrete proposals. So why is it such a slow and uneven process? What are the impediments? Another anecdote. Just before Christmas, Robert Hazel and I were giving the Christmas lecture to Chevening scholars, again about the role of the Crown, both at home and internationally. And there was a question from the audience at the end, a Jamaican student, and he asked, do you think it's appropriate that the British monarch should still be Queen of Jamaica? And of course, Robert and I said the obvious, that it's entirely a matter for the Jamaican people themselves. But there's kind of an implication behind the question, and indeed behind Patrick Robinson's remarks, that somehow this is being imposed on Jamaica from London. And I think the first thing to get absolutely clear is that is not the case at all. Either from the point of view of the British government or from the palace. Historically, if the British government has had any preference at all, it's pretty much been for countries to become republics, partly because of this question of confusion and uncertainty. It removes that confusion about Britain's post-colonial international relations. And I think the palace has been pretty much exactly the same, very pragmatic. So let's just quickly look at the British government's position first. Go back to the early 1960s. And you can see on this next slide a quote from the British High Commissioner to Nigeria, Anthony Head, from 1961. There are signs that Nigeria, which had become independent, of course, the previous year, might move to republican status. And Head says, well, the trend in Asia and Africa has been towards republican constitutions, and many Nigerians feel that they must inevitably follow the trend. And Head argues that unlike the so-called white Commonwealth, quote, the Crown is not thought of as part of Nigeria's life, but almost as a last remaining relic of colonial rule. Understandably, the ordinary Nigerian doesn't feel the same personal affection and allegiance for the Crown as does a New Zealander, Australian or Canadian, who's of British stock. You know, this idea of British people in the Commonwealth being particularly loyal or affectionate towards the Crown. And one of Head's colleagues in the Commonwealth Relations Office minuted quote, my experience in Ghana indicated that it's not only the, quote, natives, unquote, who don't understand the constitutional position of the Queen. The British are also liable to take exception to things they dislike being done in the Queen's name. So here's another factor. Whitehall is fairly pessimistic about what might happen in Africa after independence, and actually doesn't want the Queen being in some sense implicated in those events. They fear it might damage her prestige domestically. And so by the time you get to 1963, you get this extraordinary position of the British government actually encouraging African states to become republics on independence. And here's, next slide, a quotation from an official at the Commonwealth Relations Office in 1963, August 1963. He says, you know, I think of my Secretary of State's anxiety, that's Duncan Sands, that from now on we should avoid the tiresome and troublesome dual procedure under which a new Commonwealth country begins life as a monarchy and shortly thereafter switches over to a republican constitution. In Africa, we've already lived through this with Ghana and Tanganyika and are faced with two other cases in the shape of Nigeria on the 1st of October next and Uganda 9 days thereafter. Mr. Sands has, I believe, made clear to Kenyan leaders that in his view, Kenya should start her independent existence as a republic. The reasons are fairly obvious. In the first place, there are parliamentary problems in the shape of consequential legislation, which we have to deal with when a change of this kind occurs after independence. Secondly, there are difficulties with appeals to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council. But third and most important, these changes so soon after independence have an undercurrent of personal insult to the sovereign herself. And this is another point from the British government's view. There is a sense that independence is in some sense a rejection of the Queen. A republican ceremony is a further rejection, so why not get the whole matter out of the way on a single night when the country becomes independent as a republic? And that was very much the view for Africa. The West Indies, the British always acknowledged, were different. The former colonies of the West Indies had much longer historical associations with the Crown and so-called British institutions. And indeed, if you look at the kind of the timetable of independence, only Dominica achieves independence as a republic, and to date, only Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago have followed Dominica in becoming republics later on. But, you know, again, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, when it was clear in 1976 that a republic was on the cards, the British government was very relaxed about it. The British High Commissioner writes in 1976, and here's that next slide, that Prime Minister Eric Williams' attitude towards the Queen and the Crown had, quote, hardly enhanced Her Majesty's dignity in Trinidad and Tobago, and has made it even more difficult than it would otherwise have been for many Trinidadians to understand her separate status as Queen of Trinidad and Tobago, as distinct from Queen of the UK. So the Republic, when it comes, will have the advantage of defining more clearly the relationship which was becoming increasingly blurred. So again, the Foreign Office actually think that Trinidad and Tobago becoming a republic in 1976, far from damaging relations with Britain, could make them better by removing this element of potential misunderstanding. Okay, there is of course this idea that the so-called old dominions are different, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. But even in that case, in the case of Canada in the 1960s, from 1964 onwards, the British High Commissioner in Canada, Sir Henry Linto, is sending back increasingly pessimistic dispatches, suggesting that really the monarchy's days is almost at an end. That Canadians no longer really see the Queen as their Queen, but simply as the British monarch. The Palace gets a little bit irritated about this and suggests that Linto might have a bit of a bee in his bonnet about this. And of course, they're right, its days weren't numbered. But the interesting thing is the attitude of officials within Whitehall. Senior official at the Commonwealth Relations Office in 1966, J.B. Johnson, who was an old hand from the days of the end of the Central African Federation. He writes in response to one of Linto's memos, quote, "A few years ago we did our utmost to persuade African states proceeding to independence to retain the monarchy. Experience showed that because such retention wasn't rooted in the national life of the countries concerned, it didn't last. And in the interim, the position of the Queen in those countries was not respected and was in many ways resented. Similar processes involving similar national self-consciousness and national sensitivity seem to be at work in Canada, and I think we have to accept them as we accepted them in Africa." So by the end of the 60s, I think there's a sense in Whitehall that, these realms are probably on their way out, and it might not be a bad thing, and one might just have to accept that. And indeed, by the time they get round to thinking about Ceylon again and Ceylon's moves towards a republic in 1970, there's a very clear set of protocols for how to deal with this situation. First, the Queen should be informed, and if she hasn't been informed by the governor, the Foreign Office should contact the palace and let her know what's afoot. Secondly, the country involved needs to obtain the unanimous consent of Commonwealth members to remain in the Commonwealth. This will be done through the Commonwealth Secretary General. Thirdly, it was necessary for the British government to pass consequential legislation so that all existing legislation regarding that state remained in force. And fourthly, there were a whole set of protocols for Independence Day itself, messages of goodwill from the palace, from the British Prime Minister to the states involved, even a gift, an Independence Day gift. And Whitehall by 1970 had a list of these gifts that had been given to countries becoming republics. So there's a list down here: silver fruit dish to Uganda in 1963, pair of silver candelabra to Nigeria in 1963, silver coffee set to Kenya 1964, silver tea service to Malawi, silver cigar. But maybe someone in the hall can tell me why silver is this, is the linking factor behind all of this. I'm not quite sure. Anyway, the British government are thoroughly relaxed about this. Just sort of qualify this a little bit. When my book was really going to press in 2013, I went to a witness seminar at the Foreign Office, a very interesting one, which they gathered together former British High Commissioners from Canberra. And there was a session on the 1990s and how British representatives approached the issue of the Republican referendum of 1999. And I sort of assumed that, well, this was such a well-established position that the British keep out. If anything, they're quietly sympathetic towards the Republican cause. And Sir John Coles, who served as Britain's Deputy High Commissioner from 1988 to 91, confirmed that it was the High Commission's policy to keep things at arm's length. And so did Sir Brian Barder, who was High Commissioner from 1991 to 94. But Barder said, actually, at one stage the High Commission came under pressure from some people in the Foreign Office who thought the High Commission should be intervening on the side of the monarchists. They thought that the British public simply wouldn't understand if there were moves afoot in Australia, in a sense to reject the Queen, and British representatives on the ground didn't do anything about it. And one sometimes sort of makes the mistake of assuming a certain degree of constitutional literacy or collective memory on the point of view of our ministries of state. That was rather shocking. And indeed, Barder said, well, it took a visit by the Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd to Australia before the Foreign Office really relearned this old lesson from first principles. Again, I think it's a sign of the use that we can serve, ladies and gentlemen, as historians, preventing our governments having to learn all of those lessons the hard way. Anyway, leaving that aside, I think the British view is pretty clear. So is the view of the palace. And it's really exemplified in 1974 when Malta under Don Mintoff was moving towards republican status. There were fears that because the constitutional hurdle of changing to republican status was fairly high, and I'll come back to that, Mintoff might be tempted to short-circuit or shortcut the process. And the Queen's Private Secretary, Martin Charteris, was very keen to point out to Mintoff, quote, that Her Majesty will not be personally embarrassed by Malta becoming a republic, if that's what the Maltese as a whole desire, but only by being asked to do something unconstitutional. And that's the view of the palace all over. A constitutional monarch can't be embarrassed in any way by constitutional change. It's entirely up to the people themselves, and if they decide to change by constitutional means, that is absolutely fine. Indeed, in the case of Guyana, which achieves its independence in 1966, partly to deal with internal political disagreements about republicanism, there is unusually a clause within the independence constitution allowing for a transition to republicanism after a certain period of time, 42 months. The British government were rather uncomfortable with this. The Permanent Under Secretary at the Colonial Office, Sir Hilton Poynton, confessed to feeling quite a certain distaste, if not impertinence, in advising my Secretary of State to ask Her Majesty to become Queen of Guyana on 42 months probation. But actually, from the papers, we learned that the Queen herself had rather liked the idea. It seemed sensible to make provision for something that was quite likely. So the palace is tremendously relaxed, and of course, one couldn't speak to a Canadian audience without mentioning that lovely press conference that Prince Philip gives in Ottawa in October 1969, at a time when discussion of republicanism is in the air, and he says, quote, "I think it's a complete misconception to imagine that the monarchy exists in the interests of the monarch. It doesn't. It exists in the interests of the people. In a sense, we don't come here for our health, so to speak. We can think of other ways of enjoying ourselves. And judging by some of the programs we're required to do here, and considering how little we get out of it, really you can assume that it's done in the interests of Canada and the Canadian people, and not in our interests. I think the important thing about it is that if at any stage people feel it has no further part to play, then for goodness sake, let's end the thing on amicable terms without having a row about it." and this is in rather blunt terms, the sort of official line of the palace. And indeed, there was an interesting little nugget of information which came out quite recently about the Australian referendum in 1999. It was based partly on the memoirs of Australia's then High Commissioner to the United Kingdom, Philip Flood, in his 2011 memoirs, which was then sort of followed up by the Australian Financial Review, which added a few details. The story really is that the palace had prepared 3 different statements in response to different possible results from the referendum. One for a clear vote in favour of republic, one for a vote in favour by a majority of the electorate but not a majority of states, and thirdly a clear vote against. Of course it was a clear vote against, and the Australian Prime Minister John Howard really wanted a pretty kind of ringing statement that the issue was closed. According to the Australian Financial Review, the palace resisted changes suggested by Howard and kept a rather equivocal statement, admitting that, quote, for some while it's been clear that many Australians have wanted constitutional change. Much of the debate has been about what change should be. So not really kind of closing the door on any further debate. And that's still to be documented, but to me it sounds plausible. So, if there isn't tremendous pressure coming from the British government, there isn't tremendous pressure coming from the palace, what are the impediments to republicanism? Well, of course, I mean, it goes without saying, a great deal of affection for the institution of the Crown, the royal family in general, and the Queen as an individual. I think what thinks about this country, even fully diehard Republicans now would say, well, what everyone thinks about the institution, the Queen is this most amazing phenomenon. She's nearly 90, has had this quite extraordinary role in British public affairs. There's a huge amount of affection for her. And then, of course, in each realm, there are different factors either encouraging or impeding the progress of republicanism. So, for example, in the case of New Zealand, as Peter Boyce noted, the political legacy of the Waitangi Treaty of 1840 continues to overshadow the Republican debate, with fears that, in some sense, the move towards a republic might damage, undermine those long-established Maori rights. And, in the case of Canada, it's often suggested that Canada is keen to differentiate itself from its southern neighbour through its monarchical status. I think it's worth saying that given how quickly political wind can change, one has to be a little bit cautious about some of those things, that they can sometimes be simply ex post facto rationalizations of the particular situation at the moment. It was kind of quite amusing to notice that when in 1970 it looked as though Canada was moving towards a republic and Australia was very firmly fixed as a monarchy, the Foreign Office had this little debate about why they should be different. And Canada's proximity to America was actually cited, to the United States, was actually cited as a reason why Canada might have been infected by the Republican virus. Indeed, the Canadian winter was cited as a factor making for quite isolation, introspection, and inward-lookingness which had, in some sort of vague sense, also contributed to republicanism. So I think one has to be a little bit careful of those broad generalizations. So what about some concrete factors that those realms actually share? And just quickly in the final 10 or 15 minutes, let's just sort of go through some of those. Firstly, constitutionally, because of entrenched constitutional clauses protecting the position of the Queen, it's often quite difficult to move towards a republican position. Those protections often came about during the independence negotiations because the local parties were divided on the desirability of a republic. So in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, as a concession to the opposition Democratic Labour Party, had agreed that constitutional changes would require a 3/4 majority in the lower house and a 2/3 majority in the upper house. Jamaica, of course, the bar is pretty high. Changes to the executive authority of the Queen require 2/3 majority in both houses, plus a referendum. In the case of Malta, a republic could only be introduced by a 2/3 majority in the Maltese House of Representatives. And of course in Canada, since the Constitution of 1982 came into force, it's difficult, if not impossible, I would have thought, to introduce a republic. Very, very difficult, given that this would require resolutions from the Canadian Senate and the House of Commons, as well as the unanimous backing of all the provincial legislative assemblies. In the case of Australia, of course, you come across the referendum rule for major constitutional changes, which requires 50% of the national vote and at least four of the 6 states also having majorities. And of course, in 1999, the Republican campaign simply didn't get that. There are all sorts of difficulties involved in referenda, and it's probably worth touching on some of those separately. Of course, in the Australian case, probably the main problem was the motion under discussion, that the form of republic, with the Governor-General being replaced by President appointed by a 2/3 majority of members of the Commonwealth Parliament, simply didn't satisfy many Republicans who wanted a directly elected republic. And that proposal could be portrayed as a sort of politician's republic. So the proposal under discussion was probably the main impediment to a Republican vote. And then there's this whole question of a sort of broader suspicion of politicians. Commentators have noted that there have been 44 referenda in Australia over the years, and only 8 of them, has the resolution actually been passed. And that's often about a fear of the federal government strengthening its position against the states. It can also be, as I think and Toomey has mentioned, to do with voters really having difficulty getting to grips with quite complex constitutional issues, so that don't know translates into no. To take a few more simple referenda, in Tuvalu, of course, there have been 2 referenda on republicanism in 1986 and again in 2008. and both of these have failed. And in St Vincent and the Grenadines in 2009, voters were asked to support a new republican form of government to replace the Queen, and failed to do so by about 56% to 43%. In that case, and again this is a sort of problem with referenda, the debate split along party political lines, with the two major parties taking opposite positions. And in that position, you know, a referendum can be decided by a range of other party political issues. And indeed, one can say that when it comes down to a referendum, it can sometimes turn into a kind of a popularity contest between the Queen, the monarch, and local politicians. And however unpopular the monarchy might be, local politicians, one could say, are often even less popular. So it creates dangers. There's another sort of danger that the Jamaican case illustrates, and there are sort of two strands to this, really, which both illustrate the danger of getting Republican reforms through. In September 2004, mentioned before, P.J. Patterson, the Jamaican Prime Minister, announced that he'd hold a referendum on Republic by March 2005. But he was challenged by the opposition to hold a referendum not just on the Republican issue, but on a second associated issue of appeals to the Privy Council, which his government proposed to abolish. And Patterson was not prepared to hold a separate referendum on appeals to the Privy Council, and as a result, neither issue got anywhere. And it's been suggested by a Jamaican commentator, Michael Burke, that one of the reasons Patterson was wary about this sort of dual referenda was that he realised how, again, referenda could be knocked off course by other issues. That Patterson could remember back to the early 60s when there was a referendum in Jamaica about the future of the West Indies Federation, in which a lot of the campaigning actually came down to not the issue of the Federation itself, but actually subsidiary and often unconnected local issues. And again, Patterson was wary about the issue being hijacked by other kinds of issues, and I think that's an interesting point. So, a referendum is quite a kind of quite a dangerous tactic, quite a dangerous method to try and get reform through, because it can become about other things than the motion under discussion. There's a separate and I think minor issue which perhaps explains to some extent why transition towards Republican status has been slow, and I won't dwell too much upon that, but of course it's the fact that before the rules were changed in 2007, a Commonwealth country that became a republic had to reapply to Commonwealth for Commonwealth membership. And of course this resulted in South Africa leaving the Commonwealth in 1961, Fiji leaving the Commonwealth in 1987. It became an issue, rightly or wrongly, in the debate over the Republican referendum in Australia in 1999, to the extent that the Commonwealth Secretary-General, Chief-Emeka Nwuku, actually intervened and said quite clearly, quote, whatever the outcome of the referendum, there's no question of Australia's membership of the Commonwealth being in doubt. So it was very much raised. And even in the case of Mauritius in 1992, when the consequential legislation goes through the House of Parliament, it's pretty much a formality. But the spokesman for the Labour opposition at the time Donald Anson, does raise the issue that in the recent elections in Mauritius, the Prime Minister had refused to allow a Commonwealth observer force, observer team to come and monitor the election, and raised the question about whether Mauritius was really in line with the new Commonwealth values. And you might possibly suggest that the Commonwealth missed a trick in 2007 by simply saying, well, this isn't an issue anymore. If a Commonwealth country changes its constitution to become a republic, but changes it in ways that make it less democratic, for example, more authoritarian, that might well be the occasion, you could argue, for the Commonwealth to have a good look at whether that country was still an appropriate member of the Commonwealth. You might just throw that out. A further impediment, I think, to the Republican camp is the tendency of supporters of the Crown to, if you like, depersonalise the monarchy. Peter Boyce says in his book, The Queen's Other Realms, quote, an underlying theme of the Crown's evolutionary process in Canada through the past half century has been the ever-widening separation of the person of the monarch from the concept of the Crown itself, a theme also evident in the Australian New Zealand experience. So monarchists have increasingly claimed, look, we already have an Indigenous head of state. It is the Governor-General. And the Queen is not the head of state, she's merely the sovereign. And indeed, in the course of the Australian referendum campaign in 1999, the Palace changed its website to that effect, removing any mention of the Queen being head of state of the overseas realms and making that kind of distinction. So we often hear, well, it's all very well, but what happens when the Queen dies? Well, perhaps that isn't going to be such a major factor, given the way that the debate has evolved in places like Australia, Canada, but who knows? Given that sort of depersonalisation, one then gets into quite a complex cost-benefit debate. Supporters of the monarchy, certainly in some of the smaller states, would say, as they have been doing in Barbados recently, the monarchy is a guarantee of not just political but economic stability. If we accept that the Governor-General is effectively head of state, then what do you gain through the expense of moving towards a republic? And here I've just, in a final slide, just really quoted from a recent blog site by monarchists of Barbados. Becoming a republic means the expense of removing all references to royal, which in itself will cost millions of dollars, replacing titles, costumes, ceremonies, changes of royal police force, etc. Becoming a republic will neither gain us power or strength, nor will it pay off our international debts. It cannot help build us new hospitals, roads, or schools. And just to conclude, I think what you really have now, rather than a sort of meltdown of the realms, is a kind of uneasy standoff. It's very notable to a historian of imperialism how far that history is coming back onto the political agenda. It's becoming a very live issue. We're having debates about whether Britain and other European countries should pay reparations. Local politicians in the developing world talking afresh about exploitation under colonialism, colonial abuses, atrocities. We've had the Rhodes Must Fall campaign in South Africa, which has now come to to the University of Oxford in Britain about removing statues, symbols of imperialism. In that sort of climate, you would have thought that the kind of Commonwealth realms, Commonwealth monarchies would be quite vulnerable to a new wave of protest, a new wave of nationalism. And you can see, again, from the quotation I used from Patrick Robinson, how powerful that rhetoric can be. On the other hand, I think what you probably see at the same time is a kind of distrust of politicians, scepticism about politics, and with that, maybe a certain scepticism about the usefulness, the benefits of major constitutional reform. One certainly seems to see that in debates about republicanism, electorates saying, well, frankly, haven't you got anything better to talk about? When, there is poverty, there is inequality, there are schools to be built, roads to be built. And you add all of those constitutional impediments that we talked about to that. And, well, maybe not shadow boxing as a result, but a boxing match in very slow motion. And you go back to Barbados, where we started, that ringing announcement in March last year that Barbados would become a republic. What has happened since? Well, very little. Some confusion last month about whether reports in the press that the Barbados government had chosen a date to become a republic were actually true or not. We shall see. We'll have to watch the year ahead. Anyway, thank you for your patience. I hope you found this interesting. It's been a great pleasure to speak to you. My only regret is that I haven't been able to do it in person. Thank you very much.